Great to have you all here. Alex, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Scotland is traditionally seen as water-rich, you might say. But I think someone mentioned it already earlier today. You have unexpectedly found that the change in the climate is forcing you to rethink things. So how is that changing your approach?
Yeah, so just to underline the point, everybody thinks Scotland's dry all the time, but it isn't. We had the driest spring for over 60 years in the east of Scotland just in 2025, and our reservoir levels were massively down. But then to illustrate the point about the extremity of weather, which was coming up in earlier conversations today, we've then had a position where reservoirs that are about 30% full going into the winter, because we had a dry winter as well. We've then had 14 billion litres of water in the last 30 days, and now they're spilling.
Right.
So this swing...
Whiplash. Someone called that water whiplash earlier on.
Of extremes. And that changes the way you have to think about how you manage your assets, what you're investing in, and indeed how we talk to the public about water. So changing the public's perception of water is one of the things that I've been trying to do in my role at Scottish Water, particularly getting away from this presumption that it's just abundant and you don't need to worry about it.
And just also, I feel I ought to ask you you have clearly a very different regulatory environment in Scotland. So I wondered, we've heard about the importance of private investment and all the rest of it. I mean, you have a slightly different approach, the opportunity for long-term planning by government and so on. But how do you approach the challenge of securing enough investment? Because aren't you in the queue with the people who also want investment in schools and hospitals and so on, which is a different challenge?
To an extent. I mean, I think the model that Scotland has, it works pretty well, and I suppose the three legs of the stool of the Scottish model are that yes, it's publicly owned, but Scottish Water is a public corporation, so it is arm's length from government and can operate as a commercial entity. So publicly owned, yes, but run on a commercial basis, and then critically with effective independent economic regulation that creates a kind of stable long-term position. So many of the things that Sir John Cunliffe concludes in his review we sort of have aspects of that in Scotland, which in fact John reflected on in his report. But going to your particular point about the investment, we essentially almost all of the money we have comes from the bills that our customers pay. So it is a tariff-based investment system. So to that extent, the funding, if you like, comes from customers, as it does for companies in privatised.
So it's like the BBC in that sense, isn't it?
It is like the BBC. We are a public corporation, and we are funded through, in our case, water bills, rather than in the BBC's case, the licence fee. So that model is the same. The bit that sometimes can be difficult is the access to debt finance, because we can only borrow through the aegis of the Scottish Government, and to that extent we're always competing with other people who need debt from the Scottish Government.
Got it. Brilliant. Benjamin, I'd like to come to you next, because I understand that you've moved your engagement as a water utility far beyond the traditional industrial partners, and got involved with kind of the farming community and so on. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, and whether you think that's a model for utilities elsewhere.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't make it to London today. So I'd like to go down to the pub with you, but maybe next time. What Alex says sounds naturally familiar, that the way the Scottish model works, we work kind of the same way. What we add to that maybe is essentially partnering with a new range of partners, because quantity of water, availability of water is important, but preserving the quality of our water resources is also key if we want to maintain our economic and industrial models in the near decades. What we do at Eau de Paris is that we work with more than 100 farmers across the Seine River Basin, which is basically where we tap the water we need for Paris, and we help them transition to a more sustainable way of farming. I don't know if it's the case in the UK or in Scotland, for that matter. But in Paris, the main problem we have with water quality is pollutants from the farming sector, because they are really, really hard to withdraw from the water resources to make our water comply with the very, very harsh EU regulations as far as water is concerned. So we partner with them, we give them money under the Common Agricultural Policy, we give them technical advice, and we make sure that this is really easygoing for them. So it's like one desk, one person kind of deal we have with them. They don't have to beg for money from different institutions. It's just us, Eau de Paris, that runs the scheme basically. So it's very efficient. It's managed us to protect our water resources from peak pollutions, and it makes it way easier for our industrial installations and assets to deal with the quality water we get.
Great, thank you very much. So I think we've heard there, you've mentioned the importance of persuading the public that this is more complicated than they might think. And we've heard there about working closely with farmers. Stephen, I'd like to come to you. What's the role of technology in all of this? And because there's obviously various levers that utilities can pull, but tell me about your perspective.
I guess technology is there to help. It will not solve absolutely everything or every crisis. I mean, only today in the UK, there's like 90 flood warnings out across the UK. Yet in 3 or 4 months' time, we'll have drought warnings. And that really sort of like in microcosm gets to the root of the problem. And so technology isn't a panacea for that, but deployed properly, deployed in effective ways, it can support dealing with resilience and help manage those challenges. And, for us as well, because in terms of delivering this technology, you're competing in a world against other infrastructure investment across the UK, across the world for resources. There's a lack of human capital. There's a lack of trained and skilled people. And that's driving more and more people towards modularisation and off-site build and factory environments, which are safer, quicker, cheaper, much more carbon friendly, in order to be able to facilitate that. And when you think of technology, it doesn't all have to be bells and whistles, digital sort of screens and all that great stuff. Actually, some of the things around nature-based solutions are actually great elements of water technology that can be deployed relatively quickly and efficiently.
Is this a kind of sponge city sort of approach?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, if you hark back earlier this morning when you were listening to the minister who talked about you need to be more pragmatism in nature-based solutions for environmental outputs, that gets to the core of a lot of challenges in the water, is that there's a significant regulatory regime designed to address certain challenges from 50, 60 years ago. And so that lack of flexibility and regulation makes it difficult to, develop newer, innovative products for the market. And innovation itself is quite challenging in the water sector, especially in clean water where you are dealing with public health, and so it has to be right. But it takes roughly about 10 years to get a new product to market, and that's in a good year.
Right. Well, Jan, I believe your concern is that the water sector is quite often considered a bit too conservative. So how do you balance the opportunities that innovation provides with the reality that it's quite difficult to get the rules changed?
I agree. I'm coming from the private sector myself, from the chemical industry. Entered the water sector like 9 years ago, and indeed I've always been feeling like that the water sector, for good reasons to some extent, is quite risk averse, quite conservative, and as a consequence of that, I think, for instance, for startups and for scales up, it's very difficult to enter that sector. Sometimes in a lot of countries, it's public, it's political. That makes it a maze sometimes for these smaller companies. Of course, you have very large, expensive infrastructure with a long life cycle. That makes it also difficult to do real innovation. But on the other hand, I think the opportunities and the potential of innovation to really boost this sector in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of asset management, in terms of energy and raw materials recovery.
Right, so I think you're quite interested in this idea of raw material recovery, so using wastewater as a sort of input rather than an output. Tell us a bit about the, how that works and where the potential is.
Yeah, well, we have a few full-scale projects running at this moment. We are building, and it will come on stream one of the next months, a full-scale incinerator unit that is, for instance, located, that is built on the site of ArcelorMittal, which is a steel producer, providing in this way directly high-pressure steam to this facility. And on the other hand, the phosphorus from the biomass coming from over 4 million inhabitants, from the wastewater, from over 4 million inhabitants of Flanders, will be recovered and will be fed to the fertilizer industry in France.
Right. So phosphorus is something it's a sort of, I mean, yeah, it's one of the minerals we need for NPK, for fertilizer. So so you're treating the wastewater as a resource. Is that quite unusual? Is that something that others do? Do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the way of thinking about it is exactly right. Wastewater bioresources is the phrase we use for it, are a resource that can be used. And we have examples where we are using them and more that we're looking at. Things like the ability to use bioresources as a source for sustainable aviation fuel, for example, is something we're looking at in Scotland at the moment. And there are numerous examples of how bioresources have been used by water companies across the globe to actually do exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. It's a circular economy solution.
What can you get out of wastewater that helps you make biofuels, or makes it sustainable aviation?
So essentially, you can utilize the biosolids aspect of that with then treatment on top to create something that is essentially jet fuel from poo.
Okay, so it's the carbon you're taking out then. I suppose it's easier than taking it out of the atmosphere, which is the other way that people talk about this.
And it's better to link it into driving value from it. This
all sounds great, though. So does this mean we can engineer our way out of trouble?
So I don't think we can engineer our way out of trouble fully. And it's part of the point that Steve was making, is that, and again, it came up this morning, the way we ought to be thinking about these issues is in a system-wide way.
Right.
Traditionally, the water sector has tried to engineer its way through all of the problems.
But it's just
the scale of the climate change challenge we've got, whether that be on the drought side or on the flood side, is such that we have to be thinking about land use. We've got to be thinking about energy, agriculture, industry as a whole. We need to be thinking about this as societies, not as the water industry. And that, I think, is the shift that needs to happen. I would just take issue with a little bit of what Steve said. He might be talking about regulation in England, potentially. The regulatory model in Scotland has actually been quite supportive of the evolution of nature-based solutions and cross-sectoral approaches, more stable in terms of the ability to have a solid kind of progress on investment and not the roller coaster we've seen in England, but it's also flexible enough to allow for these kind of novel and innovative approaches to come through. I don't feel the regulatory kind of dead hand on what we're trying to do in Scotland coming through. You may have been talking more about
I was definitely thinking more about England in that context, but actually one of the great things and lessons that we've learned as an organisation by having really good collaborative partnerships with Scottish Water, we're a Scottish headquartered business, has allowed us to actually develop products that we can actually be deployed in the English market, which are now being taken advantage of. I mean, it's not that long ago. It would take you roughly 3.5 to 4 years to design, build and commission a new water treatment works. We can build these in 6 months in factories now and be commissioned within a year. So these things are developing all the time. And actually the regulatory environment in Scotland actually acts as an accelerant to that, because there is enough flexibility to address Jan's point about risk taking and innovation to be able to drive that. And Alex is right. There's a real systems thinking approach needed. We talked earlier about data centers. That water energy nexus is appearing everywhere. And, when we're thinking about like systems thinking and planning, why are we putting data centers in places that have got real water scarcity? When actually the sensible thing to do will put them in where there's water in abundance to deal with some of these wider systems challenges around flood, storage, renewal, recycling. And actually, how can we use modern water technology around water recycling to be able to do that? So we need to, engineering is part of the solution, but you need that wider systems thinking approach. You need the electricity, the renewables, telecoms, water, all those utilities need to work together with infrastructure, investment. There's no single one answer. Climate change is just too big.
So you've touched a couple of times on this idea of modularization and standardization and how that can speed things up. Just walk me through how that works. So that's where you have things in shipping containers instead of...
So in the evolution of that concept, it started very much in shipping containers. We built these to get these out to remote Scottish islands pretty quickly. And we developed these things called transportable treatment units. And over time, we've actually been able to create like frames that can hold process equipment. And so now it's almost a pick and mix, drag and drop section of what process you need. And so, we've just in the process of building a few of these in the South Coast with Pen and Water, one at Alderney, one at Nat Mill. These things have been built in 6 months, shipped down on wagons. We've just finished one for Ela in Shetland in Scottish Water that's been shipped. And what happens is that not only does it save a lot of time, it saves a lot of money in resources. People aren't just there, and carbon's usually important. As we head into the net zero reality that we're facing the next 15 to 20 years, we need to work really hard. And again, we've got a lot of that sort of inbuilt culture into our business because of the partnership we had with Scottish Water, who've got a real sort of, we've got a government mandate to get to net zero by 2035. And, as a supply chain partner, we're part of that journey with them. So that's helped us grow and develop these new solutions without a necessity.
So it's kind of a Lego.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just one quick thing. The Shetland one that Steve mentioned is a great example, because what we're able to do there, modularize and actually standardize as well, means that we can put something into one of the most difficult operating environments in the UK at about significantly less cost, significantly less carbon, and actually in a way we know that it's a plug and play model that will work even in the quite harsh environments of Ela in Shetland. So that is the approach we're now trying to take as standard. And as we move into our next regulatory period, we're looking at, as we move through our asset replacement program, modular, standardized.
And presumably it gives you more flexibility. You can swap things in and out if they break.
Completely. It's easier to operate as well. Yeah.
And the carbon savings come from not pouring concrete, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that particular example, something's constructed entirely off-site and then is essentially dropped in. So you're not have to deal with it in the on-site construction.
This is what they're talking about in energy with the small modular reactors. Indeed. We'll see if that goes anywhere. But I mean, it sounds like a great model. I want to turn to something that a few people have mentioned, but we haven't really dug into. But I think all of you would be very good people to ask, and that's PFAS. So, Benjamin, I'd like to start with you because I think the EU rules are already biting on this. So, on microplastics in particular, how are you responding? And do you have any what's your experience been of getting from pilot projects to compliance with these rules?
So first thing I want to say is that on PFAS and all of these pollutants that trigger a lot of anxiety across the public, transparency is something that is very important to us and to our public model management and water services. We need to regain trust of the people by not lying to them, potentially, that'd be a good idea, and by explaining to them how PFAS is a worrying issue, but it's also not the biggest environmental health issue that they have to face. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is that we always try to put in place a twofold strategy. One is to comply with the norms, obviously, and for that you need treatment. And the second part of the strategy is also to cut the tap, to shut the tap. We don't want any more PFAS being spread across the environment because there's so much of a problem from an industrial point of view. So we also try and engage with the industrial producers of PFAS, with the users in the farming sector, but also in some industrial sectors as well. And we also resort to the courts so that the cause that widespread pollution is also tackled at the appropriate level. So it's never a one-phased approach. It's always a comprehensive reflection on an issue that is really, really global across the whole of Europe, including the UK, and also across all the sectors.
Would anyone else like to come in on that challenge in particular?
For scaling up,
Yes.
there are several barriers. First of all, it's not always easy. I would say it's always difficult to have an economical case or a business case to make it possible and then to find the finance. In Flanders, for large projects like that, also getting a permit, for instance, is really difficult because it's new technology. Because, for instance, if you what we do produce drinking water or processed water from treated effluent, so from wastewater, you also have a brine that you have discharged. That's a difficulty. And for some projects, I would say scaling up is limited also by public opinion. We have, for instance, since I would think like 15 years, we are operating a small facility that from wasted treated water produces drinking water. But until like half a year ago, it was almost not possible to inject that directly in the public drinking water net because of, I would say, a psychological barrier. So it was infiltrated in the soil, then pumped up back just to have this, I would say, psychological barrier compete in this way. So since a half year, we have a full-scale facility doing that. So it's really difficult to from pilot plants to scale it up to full-scale projects for many reasons. But as has been mentioned by previous speakers already today, this awareness as well from politics, from public, from investors is increasing. So I see projects that would not have been possible like 3 to 4 years ago, that we are really building them at the moment. So we are really making progress on this point.
The one thing I'd add, I think, is that the issue around PFAS, a global issue, as we've been hearing, we must make sure we're thinking about this in terms of source control of pollution, rather than just thinking about the issue at the end.
Just mitigation at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually that's true about PFAS. It's true about many issues.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of that shift towards a more system thinking, because actually
What can
you
you
can address it.
do about that? Because there are so many sources, and
In the end, you need a legislative framework that's going to support a system approach to these things. Because for society as a whole, it is going to be better if we can address these things at source rather than at the end of the pipe. It's generally much more difficult, expensive, and turns up in customer bills if your only solution is to try, and probably fail, to engineer a way out all these issues. So that is why the legislative framework needs to evolve and must be thought about cross-sectorally, not just for water.
Yes, indeed. So we keep coming back to this. You need to see the bigger picture, and that's kind of the two go hand in hand.
Yes.
The point we're trying to make today, which is that everyone needs to take this seriously because it's part of the bigger picture.
Yes.
That also means that you can't fix this just by looking internally within the industry.
You've also got, just picking up on that, and obviously there's a lot of people in this room that will be financing it. I mean, who actually pays the cleanup costs for this?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, at the moment, it looks like it's going to fall on bill payers. And the irony here is water companies are going to have to clean this mess up. But the reality is they didn't cause it, but they're going to be the ones that are in the frame because there's a wider media circle here in the UK, especially around this. And once people start waking up and realising the impact of PFAS on themselves and their environment, that will drive totally different behaviours and conversations. And all of a sudden, regulators will need to act because you're back to this issue of trust, which gets to the hardcore, problems that we face here in the UK, is that perception that there's a lack of trust. Regardless of whether that's true or not, or how we got here,
That's what people worry about.
People worry about.
Yeah.
And so actually, how do we make a regulatory framework that actually the polluter pays? Because that's the real bit that's missing at the moment around the PFAS debate in the UK for sure.
Yeah. Now, another thing that has come up a few times, and that people are definitely worried about, and I wanted to see whether how worried do you think we should be, is the water demands of data centers and of AI. And AI, we should point out, is about 20% of all data center use at the moment. So not all data centers are doing AI all the time. Most of it's doing your Amazon and your Google Drive and your Netflix, which is a different thing. But obviously a lot of the growth is coming from AI. So how much of a challenge is that really, and how sort of are we worrying about the right things enough, or are we right to be worried about that a lot? Why don't you?
Yeah, so it absolutely is something we should be worrying about. We're seeing a massive increase in the demand for data centres in Scotland, as is true across the globe. And I think that the problem with it is not that we don't need data centres, we do, but they're not. It's this integration of the thinking, particularly around water usage,
right?
Because you need water for cooling data centres. That's fine, but we should be thinking about where we place the data centres in areas where we have, as Steve was saying earlier, relative abundance of water supply. And also we should be using final effluent as the cooling source, not potable water, because why would you do that? It's the most expensive form, and it's the under most stress. So let's think about this collectively.
Well, when people are planning data centers, the first thing they say is, where's the energy going to come from? And they also want to be where the fiber is. And that tends to mean that you're looking at cities, because that tends to be where the fiber is. So that basically, I think water's coming third in this consideration.
But I would argue for water to be up the level, particularly think about the utilisation of final effluent as the source.
Yeah. Well, then you want to be near.
And closed loop also, we need near lots of people, which fits with the city where the fibre is. And closed loop means you reduce the demand on water resources that are otherwise stretched.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to come in on data centres?
A couple of points I think is worth making is that we talk extensively about the water usage at source for cooling, but actually there's a huge amount of water being used for energy production for the data centres in the first place.
Right.
which goes under the radar and is absolutely underreported. And
Right. It's not always included in those
absolutely
calculations. It's like
never-
the energy is free and doesn't
Correct,
involve.
yeah. Forget about the actual capital costs and human costs and nature costs to the production of that energy. But I guess outside of that, this is where we need to think smarter around technology solutions as well. Picking up the points that Alex made, it's perfectly feasible to use recycle wastewater to be able to treat that. The technology already exists. Yes, there are some things that need tweaking to be able to make that happen.
So why is it not happening?
Regulation,
Right.
lack of trust, lack of innovation.
Nobody cares whether data centers drink fresh water or not. I can see why they worry about their own, water, but
But that's the default.
a
That's the
GPU
default
can't tell
setting.
the difference.
No, it can't.
The default setting is we need to get this built, so we'll just use whatever we can. We'll
Right.
get through the planning because it's data centers and so it's strategic national infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay, so once again, we run into this regulatory thing. Benjamin, what's your take on this? Are data centers on your radar as a problem?
Yeah. Obviously they are, but I'd just like to widen the scope. It's not only data centers, it's industries. And if Europe and the UK want to regain some kind of sovereignty in terms of their industries, whether they are digital industries or manufacturing industries, they need to think in terms of the necessary resources to do that. We need land, we need energy, but water, and I agree with Alex, has to be higher up on the agenda if we want to make that happen. And currently, it's not the case. And we have examples, not in Paris, because obviously Paris is too dense to host any of these big industrial facilities, but in other places in France where they have renounced installing new industrial units because of lack of water resources. That happened once already in Grenoble, in the Alps. And all of these thinking about recycling water and closed loops and so on, this is very useful. We should also think, sorry to come back to that bigger picture idea, in terms of preserving our resources from a quantitative, but also from a quality point of view. And both of these, quantity and quality, come together when it comes to water.
Thank you. Jan, I wanted to ask you a different kind of digital. I believe you're a fan of the use of digital twins. So how can that help? Because I think we think of those in construction and so on. How can that help in this industry?
Yeah, we have a few full-scale wastewater facilities now running on a digital twin. You could see that as a self-learning predictive model, and basically we use it to reduce the energy consumption of. We could.
So you've got sensors all over the real facility, and then you've got a model.
And separately in the cloud, and then you say, for instance, have it optimized for energy consumption and without losing, of course, taking disadvantage on the quality of the wastewater that we're discharging. And it works well. And I've been seeing it in the chemical industry like 10 years ago, where these kind of systems and technology is used already quite some time, but it's easier in the chemical industry because the system that you have is much better controlled. You have a lot better sensors.
You're already monitoring all of these flows. Yeah.
Where in a wastewater facility, water comes and goes, different qualities. So it's more difficult, but the principle actually stays the same. So it's kind of, you can say it's kind of artificial intelligence. And we're convinced, and we don't need to be convinced, we actually see it in our, for instance, energy consumption, that models like this can actually be used also in the water sector.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. It sounds as though technology is not the silver bullet, the panacea, but it does have a role to play. We need to see the bigger picture. And one of the things that's stopping the wider use of sensible technologies is outdated regulation. So we need to sort those out too. We're seeing some quite repeated themes coming up throughout the day so far. Anyway, thank you very much to my panelists. Please join me in thanking all of them.
Thank you very much. Well done.